much. Thank you. Hello everyone. It was a long walk to the podium. I hope you're all well. It's lovely to be back in Australia. I've been overseas, should I tell you that? In Italy and Greece, where I worked on my suntan. So it's been really nice, but it's great to be back in Australia. And thank you everyone. I can see some familiar faces already from here. It's a real privilege to be asked to come and speak to you. And I'm being told that there's something wrong. Just a moment. It looks like the battery has died. Seems to have come back on again. I've got enough wires here that you could electrocute me, I think. Anyway, it's a real privilege to be here. And as you can tell, or as you would know, I've been asked to talk to you about the proposal to insert into the Constitution a reference to and acknowledgement of Australia's Indigenous peoples, as well as the establishment of what is known as an Indigenous voice. And I'm sure many of you are aware of the proposal, and I'm sure many of you are aware of some of the debate that has been going on, and perhaps many of you as school leaders, maybe even as Christian or church leaders, have been wondering, how should we think about this? What should we think about this? What does it all mean? So what I'm going to try to do today is to explain some of the nuts and bolts of what it means, so that you can be informed and it can shape your understanding. And so I hope that that will be generally of service to you. And I've called it Some Thoughts because I suppose it's just some thoughts, but I'm going to work my way through the proposal and help you to understand exactly what is at stake. I understand I'm meant to be speaking for approximately an hour. I'm going to try and allow some time for questions at the end, and I'll try to read the audience to see whether you're falling asleep or awake or keen for questions or just want me to suddenly go quiet. Although these blinding lights makes it hard to see you all, but as long as you're smiling and awake, that'll be important. So to talk about the Indigenous voice, we need to consider its context. I need to say some things about the Constitution and about how it operates first, so that you can understand what the voice is going to be, if it is passed, and how it would operate. So bear with me if I give you a little bit of Constitutional Law 101 before we get started. And I think one of the best ways to explain the Constitution is to think about the preamble to the Constitution, which explains the way in which the framers of the Constitution understood what they were doing. And you can see that our preamble begins with a very strong statement about the role of the people in agreeing to become part of the Federation. You see that the preamble begins with the words, whereas the people of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and Queensland and Tasmania have agreed to unite and to form themselves into a federation. Have you noticed that some people are missing there, Western Australia? They hadn't agreed when the time the Act was enacted by the British Parliament, but there was provision for them to be included, and they were in the nick of time. But as one article published in a book I edited once says, Western Australia was the reluctant state. And the title of the article was The Still Reluctant State. But I make no comment anything further than that, because it has to be said that Queensland was just a little bit reluctant too, and can still be sometimes reluctant. Many of you might be aware as Christians that within the preamble there's a very clear acknowledgement of God. The idea being that the people of Australia, the people of the colonies, have agreed to unite, but they did so humbly relying on the blessings of Almighty God. And that was inserted because Christians in the colonies asked and petitioned those who were drafting the Constitution to include these words. And it has to be said that the people drafting the Constitution were not that enthusiastic, but they met with such repeated requests from so many Christians and Christian organisations and denominations that eventually they acceded to that request. And what they decided to create was an indissoluble federal commonwealth. And so we always have to remember that what we live in is a federal commonwealth constituted by or composed of the Australian states. And therefore, as we're very familiar, we always have to deal with state governments as well as federal governments, even in the regulatory environment in which you as schools have to operate, and I know that you're very fully aware of that, and I can see that you have in your program, I think tomorrow, a talk on that topic. Under the Crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and under the Constitution hereby established. In other words, our system is based and predicated on the idea that the government that's established is under the Constitution, and that the Constitution controls our governments and controls what they are permitted to do. And that's a very fundamental thing. So when we're thinking about amending our Constitution, we're amending the document that determines the terms on which our governments operate. A very significant and serious decision about amending a constitution. I draw attention to this preamble for another reason, and that is that, and this is one of the things I've looked at in quite a lot of detail in some of my work, is that the making of the Australian Constitution was a very involved process. It in fact took effectively about a decade, about 10 years of very close and open debate about the details of what would go into the Constitution. The level of consultation, the level of support it had to garner across the entire community of each of the Australian colonies was quite extraordinary. And if it's been difficult to amend the Constitution since, with many proposals failing historically, I think one of the reasons is that those who propose changes to the Constitution don't go to the sort of trouble that the founding generation did in the 1890s, when they went through that entire decade of consultation and debate and discussion. And so it's not always a good thing, I think, to rush a process of constitutional change. And the whole point of a constitution is that it needs to sustain the support of a wide spectrum of the community. And to gain that support, to gain that trust, takes a long time. And it requires very serious consultation and very open debate and discussion. So what is the Federation? It's the Commonwealth and the states, as well as local government, operating within our system, each within their spheres. And I won't go into any detail about that, except to repeat the very important point that we live in a federal system. So what is being proposed is a change to the Constitution that operates at a Commonwealth level, not a change that operates at a state or a local level. But as I will be explaining later in my talk, the proposal of an Indigenous voice at a Commonwealth level will, depending on how it's implemented, if it's implemented, have implications not just for the Commonwealth but also for the states and potentially local governments and their operations as well. We also need to understand something fundamental about the way our constitutional system of government operates in order to understand how the voice will operate. Now, many of you will be aware of the term, the separation of powers. How many of you have ever heard of that expression before, right? What it's talking about is the idea that our Constitution establishes three important institutions, exercising three important types of power. A parliament as an institution that exercises legislative power, an executive which governs, and when we say the executive, we're talking about, and I'll explain this in more detail, but just think of Prime Minister and Cabinet as a holding position for the moment about what the executive is. And then thirdly, the courts, the High Court, the Federal Court and other courts of that nature. And each of these institutions is independent. Each of them has its own chapter in the Constitution because it's so important. They're not mixed up together, they're dealt with separately. And as I'll be explaining in a few minutes, one of the significances about the proposal for an Indigenous voice is that it's given its own chapter. It's given its own chapter at a level of significance that is accorded to the Parliament, the Executive and the courts. What does each institution do? Well, the Parliament, and I hope you can you read that? It's not too small. The Parliament enacts laws, the Executive administers laws, and the Court applies law, adjudicates when there's a dispute, and determines the meaning of the Constitution as well, which has a knock-on effect on the sorts of laws the Parliament can enact and a knock-on effect on the sort of administration of those laws by the Executive. So they affect each other, and that's why I've drawn it a little bit like a cycle there. So they're independent institutions, but when they perform their functions, they have an influence on each other because they determine the way the other aspect or other institution operates. It's very important to understand that interconnectedness of the institutions. Another way of explaining it is in this diagram here. Because how does it work in practice? Well, and you probably are familiar with this just in terms of what you read in the newspapers or hear on the television or hear when people talk about these things, is executive governments develop policies and draft proposed laws. In effect, this is a simplification, but in effect that's what they do. But just because the executive wants to implement a policy, and especially just because the executive wants a law to be enacted, it just can't be enacted. It requires the parliament to actually enact the law. So there's a sense in which the executive government develops policies and implements them while the Houses of Parliament scrutinise the government and hold the government to account. They debate the proposed laws and they enact them if they agree to them. And if they don't agree to them, they don't enact them. Now, what's being proposed in terms of an Indigenous voice is what could be called a third step, because the executive government and the Houses of Parliament don't have the power to change the Constitution. The executive can propose a change, and that's exactly what the Prime Minister did. He proposed that there ought to be an amendment to the Constitution to insert an Indigenous voice, but he couldn't make a referendum to that effect occur without the Parliament passing a law to that effect. And so he had to introduce that bill and have that bill introduced into the House of Representatives and the Senate. And it was only when the House and the Senate agreed to the bill and passed it that it was possible to go to effectively a third step, which is a referendum. And that referendum is something that we expect to happen later this year, at which people like you and all citizens in Australia will get to vote on the proposal. And because we live in a federation, it's not just going to be decided by a majority of the Australian people, but it also has to garner the support of a majority of the states, which means a majority of voters in a majority of states. And because we have 6 states, that in effect means 4 states. A majority of voters in 4 states have to approve it as a fundamental requirement in order to amend the Constitution. And so that's what we have in front of us, and that's why there's a debate around it leading up to the referendum whenever it occurs later this year. Now, what about race? Because a lot of people talk about, well, this is about an Indigenous body, an Indigenous voice. What does the Constitution currently say about the subject? Well, there are 2 sections in the Constitution that principally deal with this in explicit terms. So Section 25, which will be difficult for you to understand simply by me throwing up those words there. But essentially what it's saying is that, think of the House of Representatives. All of you vote in elections for a member to represent you for your local electorate in the House of Representatives. How are those electorates determined? They are groups of people. You probably remember on election night, you'll see the newspapers and especially the TV screens will be filled with this electorate, who won this one, who won that one. Well, underlying that is a decision about how large those electorates are and what the populations of those electorates are. Because our legal system establishes that not exactly the case, but roughly the electorates have about the same population. So you have to decide who counts in that population. And Section 25 is a very interesting provision that said that if any state law excludes or disqualifies the people of any race from voting, then persons of that race resident in those states should not be counted in reckoning the total number of the population for working out those electorates. Now, let me just cut to the chase and explain to you what that means in practice. What it means is, if a state, say of New South Wales, because Queensland would never do it, actually wanted to disqualify people of a particular race from the right to vote, they would lose representation in the House of Representatives as a consequence, because they wouldn't have as large a population, which is the way it determines how many electorates and therefore how many representatives you get in the House. So actually Section 25, even though it looks like it's a discriminatory, actually creates an incentive not to discriminate. Do you see the point? So you might read it and go, oh, look, that's awful. but actually creates a reverse incentive not to discriminate. The other important provision on race is section 5126. And it's a provision that gives the Commonwealth Parliament the power to make laws in relation to a particular topic. And it's the people of any race for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. Now, many of you will have heard of the very famous referendum of 1967, which was seen as a real achievement of recognising the equality of Indigenous people. Well, what technically it did, amongst other things, was remove those words that I've crossed out on the slide, other than the Aboriginal race. Because what this effectively meant was that by removing the words other than the Aboriginal race, it meant that the Commonwealth Parliament had the power to make laws, special laws for Aboriginal people. Before 1967, those words other than the Aboriginal race meant that the Commonwealth did not have the power to make special laws for Aboriginal people, which meant in effect that the states had the power to do it. Do you see? So what effectively happened in 1967 was a transfer of responsibility of the power to make laws for Indigenous people from the states to the Commonwealth. And that's what was achieved in 1967. Now, I only mention those to provide you with some context for the proposal for an Indigenous voice. What is the constitutional proposal? Have any of you had a chance to actually read the proposal? Put your hand up. So there's a few, not many. That's interesting, right? Well, this is it, right in front of you. These are the words that is proposed to be put into the Constitution. And what I'm going to now go through is to walk you step by step as to every element that's being proposed and to try to explain to you in brief terms the consequences and significance of each element. So how about we get started? Are you following me sufficiently? Good. Well, first we start with the very important observation that what's being proposed is to create a new chapter in the Constitution, Chapter 9. Currently, the Constitution consists of 8 chapters, and I mentioned a little while ago that 3 of them deal specifically with the Parliament, the Executive and the Judiciary, the courts. So what is being proposed is that the Indigenous voice would have its own chapter in the Constitution. Now, this is very significant because what it does or proposes to do is to give the Indigenous voice a status constitutionally that is structurally equivalent to the status of the Parliament, the Executive and the Judiciary. An alternative approach would have been to insert reference to an Indigenous voice in one of the other chapters of the Constitution, perhaps in the chapter on the executive government, perhaps in the chapter that deals with more miscellaneous matters. That would not have given it a chapter of its own. Why is that significant, to give it its own chapter? Well, not only does it give it a status equivalent to those other institutions, but the High Court of Australia, which has the responsibility to interpret the Constitution, has said that implications can be drawn from the Constitution based on its structure and not just on the literal words that are used in the Constitution. So, the Constitution structurally consists of chapters: Parliament, the Executive and the Judiciary. The High Court of Australia has said that that structural characteristic of the Constitution leads to an implication of the separation of powers. So, for example, the High Court has said that judicial power is a power that can only be vested in a court and not in an executive body because of the separation of powers. Now, the Constitution nowhere says you can't do that, but the court says it's an implication of the Constitution simply by structuring it in this way. And so one of the things I said in a submission to the Joint Parliamentary Committee on the Voice with a colleague, another professor of constitutional law at Sydney University, was that the Australian people need to recognise that by placing the Indigenous voice into a chapter of its own gives a ground for, gives a basis for arguments that there might be certain implications to be derived about the voice that go beyond what literally the proposed language of the proposal says. It's not possible to predict exactly what those implications would be. But if they were to be derived, if they were to be argued, they would have something to do with the status of the voice, having a status equal to the Parliament, the Executive and the Judiciary, and about its relationship to them, and about its significance as well. Now, keep in mind that concept of significance here, because as I work my way through the detailed language of what is being proposed, that background concept that the voice has this high-level significance in the Constitution has the potential to shape the way the High Court interprets the significance of particular provisions, the purple detail that I'll come to in a minute. Do you see what I'm getting at? It's a question of interpretation, right? Look, I can give you an analogy. I mean, even when you think about interpreting Shakespeare, or when you think about interpreting the Bible, right? It's significant to think about how has Shakespeare structured this story about Romeo and Juliet. You know, how significant is it, the simple title, Romeo and Juliet? We know they're the two central characters. You see the point? And that shapes the way you interpret all the characters and all the development in that. Same with interpreting the Bible, same with interpreting the Constitution. It's significant to give the Indigenous voice its own chapter, and as well its own section. So what's being proposed further is to insert section 129 into the Constitution, entitled Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. And then we see those words in white that I've now highlighted, which says, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. Now that's preliminary language. It's like a preamble. It doesn't have on its terms any direct effect, except to say that what follows is being done in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. So that language in and of itself could be said not to have any direct operative effect, but it colours and shapes then the interpretation of the rest of what's being proposed. And what I think is particularly significant here is that it's in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. And as Professor Gerangelos and I said in our submission to the parliamentary inquiry, recognising Indigenous peoples as, quote, first peoples of Australia itself has constitutional implications. Now, how do we unpack those constitutional implications? One way of unpacking them is to go back to the preamble to the Constitution itself and remember that it begins with the words, whereas the people of New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, etc. have agreed to unite. What the proposed section 129 says is that there is another body of people who are recognised as first peoples of Australia, alongside the people who agreed to unite in a federal commonwealth. So there's a sense in which what the proposal is doing is proposing, in a sense, a more complicating conception of Australian peoplehood. Right? We have the people referred to in the preamble, which is all of us, and we have peoples, a particular body of peoples who are recognised as first peoples. Now, the further way of unpacking what that might potentially mean is to think about, well, what does first peoples mean? Now, some of you may be aware of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which came before this proposal for a constitutional amendment. And in that Uluru Statement from the Heart, a different word is used. The reference is to the First Nations of Australia. Now, what's the difference between referring to nations and peoples? Tricky. It's a subtle difference, if there is a difference at all. Interestingly, the Uluru Statement doesn't only say First Nations, it says First Sovereign Nations. And that gives you a bit of a clue. The term nation carries with it a concept, if you look at the dictionaries and look at the way in which the word's used legally. of a self-governing people who possess a certain territory and have their own government. A people can also carry that same connotation. So when you use the expression First Peoples, if you look at the dictionary definitions, if you look at the international treaties on this subject matter, the terms become virtually interchangeable. So it's an interesting choice for the draftspersons who drafted this to choose the expression First Peoples and not First Nations, but also noting that the terms are virtually interchangeable, especially when read in the light of international law. So to what extent does this involve an invocation not just of First Peoples or First Nations, but as the Uluru Statement says, First Sovereign Nations, is a very important question the Australian people need to consider. What does that mean, or does it have that implication? A third way of beginning to unpack the significance of just these words in recognition of First Peoples is to bear in mind something else. Australia is a country that is quite similar to quite a lot of other countries of the world, like Canada or the United States, but let's take Canada as a first example. In fact, the similarities between Australia and Canada are very strong, right? Both countries had Indigenous Aboriginal peoples inhabiting the land, or parts of the land. They both experienced colonisation from England, but also in the Canadian case from France. And they both obviously have involved large influx of migrant peoples into their lands over the course of the last 2 to 3 centuries. That might be an exaggeration in Australia's case, but yeah, no, it is, you know what I mean. And so they're very similar countries. Now, in Canada, they have similar questions about how to relate to the Aboriginal peoples. And the Supreme Court of Canada has said that the Crown, the British Crown, which is effectively like saying the Canadian government in legalistic language, the Canadian government owes a fiduciary duty to Aboriginal people that whenever it acts, it must act in a way that consults with them, but also acts in their interests. So in fact, Aboriginal people in Canada have the right to be consulted when governments make decisions about them. And if they consider that the consultation is not sufficient, or if they consider that the decision is not in their interests, they have the right to take the matter to court and argue that that's not the case, hold up the decision, or force the decision to be reconsidered in the light of what they claim to be what would be proper consultation and what would be a measure properly in their interests. Now, when we look at the proposal in section 129, I'll just take you very quickly down to something I'll come back to later, which is the right to make representations. It's often been said in the public debate that the only thing that's being proposed is that the Indigenous voice will have the right to make representations. So that's the right to say things to somebody, to make claims, to make a representation that this ought to be the case or this ought not to be the case. This law should be passed, this law should be repealed, this policy should be adopted, this policy should be rejected, right? A right to make representations. But just like in any organisation, you might receive representations, but you're not obliged in any sense even to consider them legally. But even if you do consider them, you're not obliged to show that in your decision-making processes you've given due weight to them and your decision is reviewable by another body. When that's the case, the right to representations is more than a right to just make the representation. It's the right to be consulted, and it's possibly the right to have your interests respected. Now, the interesting question then is that does this proposal mean that there will only be a right to make representations, as quite a lot of lawyers have argued? Or does it have wider implications that are not explicitly stated but will be inferred by the courts when it comes down to a contested case about these matters? Also because several of the documents that have gone into this whole question of how to handle the issue have said quite explicitly that Aboriginal people should not only have the right to make representations, but have a right to be consulted and a right to have their interests accommodated in any policy making. So it does seem to me that there's real implications for this to develop in Australian law. In fact, it has already been argued before the High Court of Australia, and one judge of the High Court has said there is effectively a fiduciary duty owed to Aboriginal people. And so the question will be whether, if this is inserted into the Constitution, that will lay a foundation for the High Court of Australia to take that conclusion to its logical conclusion or not. Now, I say this because I think it's just simply important that the Australian people understand the implications. Don't take me to be arguing for this or against it. I'm trying to explain its real meaning. But I am concerned that in the public debate, some legal voices have been saying that the proposal does not have the sort of implications that I'm talking about. But I think it's very plainly the case that it does, and the Australian people need to understand that when they make a decision about whether they're going to vote in favour or against the proposal. Now, let me take you now to paragraph 1, as it were, because we now come to the aspect of the proposal which says there's to be a body. And notice the mandatory language, there shall be. Right? That's mandatory language, and the Constitution, because it's a mandatory document, is mandating it must exist. Whether it will exist or not is an interesting question. What if the Parliament never passed a law to establish it after this amendment went through, if it was to be passed? That's an interesting question, because already in our Constitution, in section 101 of the Constitution, which is not contained in its own chapter, but in a miscellaneous chapter, I might note, there's provision for a body called the Interstate Commission. In fact, section 101 says, there shall be an Interstate Commission. Have any of you heard of the Interstate Commission? Does it exist? It doesn't exist. It has existed in the past. It had its problems. Governments have in effect abandoned the idea. So how could that be? How could the Constitution say there must be a body, but then the Interstate Commission doesn't exist? If the Constitution says there must be an Indigenous voice, must it exist? Why hasn't anybody forced the government to create an Interstate Commission? I think the simple answer to that is nobody's tried. Nobody wants it. Nobody's prepared to pay the money to bring a case in the High Court to try to force the Parliament to enact and create the Interstate Commission. And there's some questions around whether you could force the Parliament to pass a law, but because the Constitution is mandating its existence, it raises some very interesting questions about the extent to which the courts can dictate to the Parliament about what laws it should enact or not enact. And so the voice proposal is opening up, as it were, that issue by speaking in mandatory terms as it does. Now, the body is called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, and it's a body. So it's not an individual, it seems to be a body, and it's called an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. What does this mean in practice? Let me scoot down to 3 for a minute and just notice that in 3 it's being proposed that the Parliament shall have power to make laws with respect to the voice, including laws about, as you can see, its composition. Do you see down the bottom there? Its composition. So, to what extent can the Parliament create laws to determine the composition and nature of the voice? Or to what extent, if we skip back up to 2 again, to what extent do these words control the sort of voice the Parliament can create? Well, the answer, I think, is that paragraph 1 here, or clause 1, is determining what the Parliament can do. And it's saying you must establish a body, it must be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and it must be a voice. Do you see the point? And then beyond that, if you jump down to 2, it must be able to make representations. These are mandatory requirements that are being proposed in clauses 1 and 2. And that is why when we speak of the Parliament shall have the power to make laws about it, notice the words subject to this Constitution. So those words subject to this Constitution, which are controlling the power of the Parliament to make laws about the voice, right? Subject to the Constitution includes paragraphs 2 and 1, or clauses 1 and 2. In other words, the power in 3 is subject to the requirements of 1 and 2. Does that make sense? I'm talking lawyer's logic here, but it should be common sense logic as well. So it means that at a fundamental basis, the voice must be Aboriginal. It must be Torres Strait Islander. But what does that mean in practice? Here we come to one of the first questions of detail that hasn't been really provided to the Australian people by the government. There is a report that was made and issued under the leadership of Marsha Langton and Tom Calmer, which was part of the co-design process for a possible voice. And I'll be drawing on what they say in that report to fill in the gaps, but it's very important to note that the federal government has in no way endorsed or indicated a commitment to doing what Langton and Calmer have proposed. But it's the nearest thing to detail that we have, and it's worth bearing in mind what they are proposing when we think about it. So one of the things we learned from their report is that what they think is the case is that how would the voice be Indigenous? What would make it Indigenous? Now you can imagine one way would be that it gets elected by Indigenous people. And so you establish that you're Indigenous, there's a special electoral roll, there's a special election, and if you're Indigenous you get to vote in it, and there are people who nominate as candidates for being members of the voice, and the Indigenous people of Australia get to vote on that proposal. Now that would be the most, I think, straightforwardly democratic way of doing it, because it would be analogous to the way in which we elect members of Parliament today. However, Calmer and Langton don't actually strongly propose that. What they propose is something much more complex and could be said to be vague. Let me draw our attention to something else about what paragraph 1 says. Notice that the word voice is in the singular as well as the word body. So it suggests that there's to be one voice, one body, and not many bodies. What Langton and Calmer propose is in fact that there would be many voices. Their proposal is that there would be a national voice consisting of 24 members. There would be 35 regional voices for 35 regions across the country. And then there would be many local voices across all of the localities of the country. And they don't even try to number them, but one would assume they would be in the hundreds. Maybe 300, 400, 500, who knows, because they could correspond to local government units, or they could correspond to Indigenous nations or clans, or some combination of that. So what Langton and Calmer are proposing is that the voice is not just a single voice, but it's a multi-layered voice of a national voice, 35 regional voices and hundreds of local voices. The idea being twofold, that the local voices would make representations to local governments, the regional voices to state governments, and the national voice to the national or federal government. And then on top of that, that in some sort of cascading system, the local voices would somehow choose the regional voices and the regional voices would choose the national voice. And what they propose is not so much that these bodies would be elected, but that it would be worked out in consultation with communities, organisations, stakeholders and so forth, in what has to be said is not an entirely clear process, but somehow involving all of those bodies. You can understand why the government hasn't wanted to commit to such complex detail, because it's a very complex question of asking how do you appoint an Indigenous voice, and also do you decide to just have a national voice, Or do you have regional voices? Or do you also have local voices? And if you do so, what implications does it have for our federal system, where we have our state governments and our local governments, each with their own jurisdiction, each with their own constitutions, and each with their own policies in relation to relations with Indigenous people? So there's an underlying federalism question embedded in this proposal as well. Notably, Clause 1 does not say a national voice, it just says a voice. So it is arguably open to a layered voices, as it were, in the way that Langton and Calma are proposing, but it's also open to a singular voice that might just be established at a national level. And I can imagine governments facing some real difficulties in trying to create a multi-tiered voice. But one of the problems here is that one of the objectives of the voice is to try and empower Indigenous people to have an input into the decisions that affect them. And the sorts of people that are most powerless are people at a local level and not at a national level. So if the voice is to make a difference for Indigenous people, it seems to me that it has to empower localities much more than it empowers regions, let alone national spokespersons. So there's a real complex policy question underlying this as well that I don't think has been fully thought through at this stage. Now, let's just come to now the making of representations, and I won't repeat what I said before except to just underscore the point. And that is that even though a lot of lawyers are saying that it's only a right to make representations, it has more implications than just that, to make representations. Let me explain in another way why it means more than what appears. Try to be an expert in constitutional law, but there's another body of law that we lawyers called administrative law. And it's very closely related to constitutional law, but the focus of administrative law has to do with decisions made by the executive bodies. And when an executive body has a power to govern something, and it could even be some of the bodies that you deal with, you know, as schools, like some of the educational regulatory bodies, right? They have certain powers of regulation over you. Now, when they exercise those powers, they are required by law to take into consideration all of the mandatory factors that are relevant to their decision and are not permitted to take into consideration irrelevant considerations or factors or matters. And if you as an organisation think that they have failed to take into consideration some mandatory relevant factor, you can take them to court and get the court to force them to go through the whole process again and make sure that they consider what you want them to consider. So it gives you actually administrative law potentially quite a lot of capacity to force agencies to reconsider their decisions and therefore have an effect on the outcome and the actual decision that they end up making. Now, this clause 2 will operate in the context of that principle of administrative law. So it's not simply the case that the voice will have the right to make representations, right? It will be that executive decision makers will be required to take into consideration those and to demonstrate that they have, and it will be possible for parties to take a case to the court to argue you failed to take that into consideration and force the decision to be taken again if there's a failure to give proper consideration. So that's at a very minimal level. So I'm trying to draw your attention to a variety of sort of implications that arise as a matter of law from this. The other thing to note is that the right to make representations is both to the Parliament and to the executive government. What does that mean? So one of the things about representations, even if you just look up an ordinary dictionary definition of the word representation, is that when you make a representation to an institution or an organisation, you know that you can do it in writing, but you can also do it orally. You can do it publicly, but you can also do it privately. Now, arguably, if the Constitution says there's a right to make representations, it covers oral and written, public and private. It doesn't restrict it. And so one of the interesting questions will be is whether the Parliament under Clause 3 will have the power to require submissions or representations to be in writing or to be done in public or to be publicly available in freedom of information claims so that not just ordinary Australian citizens but Indigenous people can know what the voice is saying to government on their behalf. Because we always have accountability problems in any organisation where someone purports to speak on behalf of someone else. If that's the case, it's very important that the persons being spoken on behalf of have an opportunity to know what actually is being said. So there's a whole lot of issues in and around that sort of accountability and transparency of the processes. Related to that, the fact that the submissions can be made to the executive government is significant because in the Constitution, executive government is a term that's used to designate much more than the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. Right? It's not just a right to make submissions to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. Actually, theoretically, it's a power to make representations to the King. I have to say the King now, not the Queen. Also the Governor-General, the Prime Minister, all of the ministers in the Cabinet. But beyond that, executive government includes the bureaucracy. It includes the government departments. It includes not just the heads of those government departments, but every civil servant. Every, in fact, agency of government, especially agencies established by statute and given public functions. The interesting borderline question will be whether it applies to something like the ABC, a corporation formed by statute to perform certain public functions, but not strictly governmental functions. Right? There'll be borderline questions about a whole lot of agencies, not like the ABC, but other regulatory agencies or statutory organisations. To what extent will these be part of the executive government? For example, will it include the central bank? Will it include those sorts of agencies and regulatory bodies? I don't think the answer is really clear. And it will come down to, for me, a constitutional lawyer, a fascinating question about what executive government means in the abstract. Can you see how that's at least an interesting question? Because you try to work out what a vague general term like that means when it can potentially constitutionally include a very wide variety of institutions. Now, why is this significant? Because it goes to what will happen in practice. What can we expect in practice as a result of the proposal? Now, I'll start to wrap up now and then we might have some time for questions, I hope. And that is, well, what will be the matters on which submissions can be made? Now, you'll see that Clause 2 is saying that the submissions need to be on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Now, that might seem straightforward, but as soon as I read this, in fact, as soon as I read all of these things, I went, oh. Well, here's an interesting oh, and that is the word relating to is deliberately chosen. In section 51, when we speak of the powers of the Commonwealth Parliament, the words used are with respect to, not relating to. And in lawyers' language, to say that you have a power to make laws with respect to a subject matter is a very broad power to make laws on that subject. But to use the language relating to is a word of even wider significance, I think, than with respect to. It's fine distinctions of language and lawyers' interpretations, but what it effectively means is a matter relating to Indigenous people is not necessarily or simply a matter that affects them directly and is targeted at them or for their benefit, but can include anything that relates to them or affects them in some sort of way. And if you read the government documents that have discussed this question, they've indicated that it's a very broad idea indeed. And in fact, very interestingly, in Langton and Calmer's report, and in one of the actually earlier reports, there's a suggestion that what relates to Indigenous people for these purposes will be determined by the voice itself and not by any third party. So there'll be an interesting question about the extent to which the voice itself can determine what is relevant and the extent to which the court might say, oh, but that's not relevant at all. Do you see we have this question about who decides what's relevant? I think there'll be some interesting potential questions of relevance there. Now let me close by looking at the Parliament, because in a lot of the debate, the discussion is the discussion point that's made is that for all of these vaguenesses and interesting possible implications, it's all subject to the Parliament. Now, what I've tried to point out is that it's not all subject to the Parliament, because the Parliament's powers are subject to the Constitution, which means they're subject to paragraphs 2 and 3, clauses 2 and 3. And so any powers the Parliament has have to nonetheless comply with what appears above these powers. But certainly it's given powers to make laws, notice it, with respect to matters relating to. Now how's that for a mouthful when you really think about it? You know, if one of your students was drafting an essay and they said, oh, with respect to matters relating to, you might go, why are you using the word with respect to and then relating to, right? But what they're trying to do is construct a capacity to make laws that builds on a notion of with respect to and then relating to. And it sort of doubles up. It'll be fascinating to see how it's interpreted. It is a phrase that's used elsewhere in the Constitution, so it might just get interpreted in the way that other phrase is used. But finally, the point is that the Parliament has the power to determine its composition, functions, powers and procedures. I touched on its composition a moment ago, but there's much more detail in Calmer and Langton's report, where, as I said, it's proposed that the national body will consist of 24 people somehow chosen by those 35 regional voices, and those 35 regional voices somehow chosen through several hundred, however many hundred local voices. So there's going to be questions about how will the body be composed. Will it be elected like the parliaments are, based on an equal vote of individual Indigenous people, or will it be through communities and organisations? And notice Calman and Langton use the expression stakeholders. And you probably are familiar with that term and know what that can mean. Unclear exactly what it might mean in this context, stakeholders having an influence on that. So there's many more things I could say, but I'll just start to close down now by just saying functions and powers and procedures. They're very interesting concepts. What exactly will be the powers and functions that are given to the voice will be, interesting, and I could say some things about that, but I have a feeling I've said enough to convey something of a survey. I can see that people are now just starting to wane. In fact, you're probably all starting to lose interest about half an hour ago, I know, I can tell. But look, let me open it for questions. What time did I start talking? Probably 50 minutes ago? How long have I gone for? You probably have. But can I just, are there any questions from the floor, or is that, yes sir?
In the earlier statement it talks about sovereignty, and it tries to talk about spiritual sovereignty, but doesn't sovereignty mean I own this country?
It's a good question. Look what I've done there. Here's the Uluru Statement. I don't know if you can all read that, right? It certainly has, as you've just pointed out, spiritual statements. But here's the statement about sovereignty. And interestingly, can you read it? Yeah. See how it says sovereignty is a spiritual notion? Interesting statement. And it involves ownership of the soil or sovereignty. There's the claim that it's never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown, and this ancient sovereignty can shine through to a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. That's what the Uluru Statement says about sovereignty. Now, sovereignty is like one of the most contested terms in the history of political thought and constitutional thinking, right? So in international law, it has a fairly well-defined meaning, which is similar to what I think you were indicating. It's the power that a state has. And a state is a nation that in international law is recognised as possessing a certain territory and having sovereignty over that territory. And that sovereignty means the power to determine what goes on in that territory, the laws and the policies that are applied. It also has an implication of immunity, meaning other states don't have the right to tell another state what to do, right? So it sort of has a positive power to determine what happens within your jurisdiction, your territory, and also an independence from or an immunity from other states telling you what to do. That's what sovereignty means in international law. What it means in this context is maybe somewhat more complex, because what's being proposed is some sort of sovereignty that is spiritual, but nonetheless involves ownership of the soil, that is not something that is ceded or extinguished, which seems to be inferring something more like that national thing. But then again, it coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. So it's a complex sort of question. I've got time for one more question? Or two? Question up the back, sir.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not very loud. Did you think the second reading speech in Parliament answered uncertainties that you highlighted before? I thought the intention of the second reading speech was to give a side that would be used in the High Court if ever it came down to a question of intention.
No, I don't think it did. So I don't think it did, partly because the second reading speech, if I recall it correctly, relied heavily on the advice of the Solicitor General. And if you read the Solicitor General's advice, the Solicitor General does not address any of the questions that I raised in my submission to the Parliamentary Committee. In other words, whatever might be the strength or value of what the Solicitor General said, he was asked very specific questions that weren't questions about what I've asked. So I don't really think that that fully really answers that question. There are some technicalities about the influence of a second reading speech as to the interpretation of an amendment, and it does have some weight in how a provision will be interpreted, but it's only one factor among many. And what the High Court has always said is that when it's trying to discern the intention of a statute, it's not just the second reading speech that's relevant, it's the full body of the debate, it's reading the language in the context in which it's expressed, and it's understood in the context of the Constitution as a whole. And so it's only when you take all of those things into consideration that you can work out what the implications are. And so we were very careful in our submission not to say we know what the implications will be. Rather, we said we can see that these implications will be argued. They are very arguable, but exactly what answers the court might give to those arguments, nobody can predict with certainty, even if you're a Solicitor General. I hope that's a helpful answer to your question. Time for one more or no? No more questions? Oh, one more. Yes, sir.
I've got cheeky two questions, actually.
Yep.
I think it was a few weeks ago, Geoffrey Blaney wrote in The Australian that it's potentially a departure from the fundamental notion of democracy being one vote, one person. And my second question is, I think it was Tony Abbott that wrote, why would we specify, something I'm very interested in, of course, why would we specify race in the Constitution, something we've been very careful to avoid?
Yeah. Look, with one vote, one person, that's part of the reason why I talked about the people at the beginning, because there's a fundamental concept in our Constitution, which I didn't enlarge on fully, that the Constitution is based on the people of Australia, and underlying that is the idea that every Australian citizen has an equal say in the government of the country. And the High Court has said that several times. That's a very fundamental principle. So I think that by introducing a new chapter with a new concept of peoplehood, the High Court's going to have to grapple with how will we match those two concepts and what implications will it have for the concept of equal citizenship and voting rights. It may not have a direct effect specifically on the right to vote for the Parliament per se, but it could shape the way the High Court interprets it. What was the second question again? It was very quick.
Specifying race.
Sorry. Oh, and race, yeah. Look, I mean, it has been the trend of Australian constitutional policy to become more and more race blind, to remove references to race and to not adopt a racially discriminatory policy constitutionally, legally or politically. And, you know, fortunately, we've gone in that direction. This is a movement in that sense back towards reinforcing a certain definition of race, as it were, or at least indigeneity as being a category which gives you certain rights, which is different from that general trend. I think that's true. Thank you very much.